much faster than anything that the average US Army Air Force pilot had encountered, flying things like the B-18 Bolo, which probably had an approach speed around the same as the DC-3, which was something like 90 miles per hour, 75 over the fence, and that sort of thing. So there was inevitably inexperienced pilots were going to get slow on final approach, stall aircraft, and go straight in. So this was definitely a problem. There were some CFG problems in early types of the early versions because they lacked the correct dorsal turret. So the calculated weight distribution was not what it should have been. They had weak nose landing gear assemblies which collapsed on taxi, takeoff, and landing. If they'd had a proper prototype, this sort of thing would have been identified in the prototype, and production models would have had a stronger landing gear from the beginning. No amount of calculations are going to work out what your landing gear strength will be in actual conditions. So that had to be beefed up. The Curtiss electric propeller was a very sophisticated constant speed unit. And it was quite maintenance intensive, especially it was a problem for inexperienced technicians. The Hamilton system is hydraulic, and it uses a pilot valve with oil pressure to change the pitch of the propeller, and a fairly simple constant speed mechanism using flyweights to maintain the selected RPM. I've never used an electric propeller before, but I did read up a little bit about it, and it's quite a sophisticated device. But when it wasn't working properly, then a runaway propeller would be the result. Now this can happen with a hydraulic unit, a Hamilton unit. We had it on the DC-3 and DC-4, and it's pretty scary because it means that it's like taking your car at sort of cruise speed and ramming it in low gear. I mean, the engine just wants to burst out. The RPM runs away on the engine, which could then seize or break its crankshaft. So to slow down a runaway propeller would be to reduce airspeed in the quickest way possible, to reduce the RPM of that engine and the stress on its reciprocating masses. So a very scary thing to happen. It also creates a lot of drag, and if it happens on one side, it's almost the same as an engine failure. And then, of course, there's the other side is when it fails to feather. If you have an engine failure and the electric propeller won't feather the prop, then you're sitting with this disking propeller, which is creating huge amounts of drag, and in critical situations can cause the aircraft to crash. So this was a big problem as well. Largely maintenance problem. The single engine safety speed after takeoff was higher than previous bombers. I'll go into this in more depth in the next slides. But again, this is the sort of twin sister of the high approach speed. It was something that pilots were very unfamiliar with, and caused a lot of accidents. So much so that during the training of pilots, I remember these guys had come straight off primary twin engine trainer types, like possibly the Beech 18 and the Cessna UC-78 Bamboo bomber. And now they were put in this high performance hot ship, as they call it, Marauder, which is the biggest airplane they'd probably ever sat in. And we expected to fly this. And a lot of training accidents took place at this field called MacDill in Florida. And, they got the rhyme, one a day in Tampa Bay, because these guys were crashing left, right, and center. So anyway, this was unacceptable, and Senator Truman, who later became President Truman, was asked to lead a Senate special committee to investigate this. And this wasn't the only thing he was investigating as well, because the company founder, Glenn Martin, was called before this committee, which was investigating the National Defense Program in toto. And they were looking also at things like defense contracting abuses. So anyway, Senator Truman apparently asked Mr. Martin what the problem was and why there were so many accidents. And Martin replied that the wings were too short. Because of all the equipment they were piling on, they were making this high wing loading even worse. So Truman asked him, why haven't the wings been changed? And Martin replied, the plans were too close to completion. His company already had the contract. And Truman was testily told him that they will, in that case, if you don't change the wings, we'll cancel the contract. So this was one of the things they did. They actually lengthened the wings and did quite a few other changes to try and sort this problem out. So the other thing that the Truman Committee was investigating was the cost of this aircraft, because they were saying this thing shouldn't be in production. It's too expensive. It can't do the job. It's a death trap, etc., etc. So this is some comparative costs for US bomber types in the 1942 pricing. The pricing varied through the war for the aircraft. They actually got cheaper as the years went by. So I've just taken a snapshot of 1942, and there you can see the prices with the B-26 being a lot more expensive than the Boston Havoc, which is the A-20. A slightly smaller aircraft, be sure, but I mean it's nearly double the price. The B-26, the B-25, as we saw, was very comparable. Was a hell of a lot cheaper over there. So everyone wanted to know why. But if you look at it, it was a very sophisticated aircraft with a lot of equipment, and it just ended up as a more expensive aircraft. But at that stage, Hap Arnold wanted as many bombers as he could get his hands on, and there was no ways he was having this program terminated. So they lucked through, and the B-26 continued in production, but with serious modifications, and that's what we're going to have a look at next. Why am I? Sorry, I was talking about the pricing, and the slide didn't move on. Sorry, folks. There it is. There are the various prices. As you can see, the B-26 over there, a lot more expensive than the B-25, which is its natural sort of comparator. There we go, fixing the problems. So, as I mentioned, the wings, because Mr. Truman said they'll cancel the contract, they hastily extended the wings by approximately 1 meter each side. So it went from meters 3 foot, so it was almost a 6 foot extension on to the wingspan. They added flaps outboard of the engine nacelle, so that they had some more lift generating devices, and would assist with takeoff and landing. The vertical stabilizer or tail was increased in height by 0.5 meter. This was in response to problems with directional control. I've taken some info from Kermit Weeks, who had a airworthy B-26 in his collection, and he also claimed that even despite the increased tail, the aircraft was a little unstable in the yawing plane and tended to hunt around. So there was obviously a problem, and this was an attempt to cure it or reduce the yawing effect when it was flying straight and level. Then another thing they did was increase the angle of incidence of the wing. Now, this is quite a radical change, because the angle of incidence would mean that you'd have a greater angle of attack when the aircraft is in its takeoff roll, which would certainly help with some of the problems they encountered there. But it would also mean that the relationship in flight between the sort of centerline axis of the fuselage and the wing will change. And whether that created more drag or not, or it reduced drag, maybe there was an error in the calculations of the designer, but they felt necessary to change the angle of incidence of the wings, which is a major production change to improve the safety record of the aircraft. And then they installed an APU, which was a little piston engine driving a generator in the tail of the aircraft very noisily to provide electrical power, because what they were finding was the batteries would be run down by the time the aircraft got to the holding point, and if there was any delay. And during the takeoff run, the battery voltage, the aircraft generators weren't charging it on the ground, because the aircraft generators, it's a bit like an old car with when you're at idle, then the generator doesn't charge the battery. So with extended idling at the holding point or taxiing, the battery's voltage might drop, and then you had problems with those electric propellers that I spoke about. So they then started trying to have accessory trolleys to keep the batteries charged until the aircraft was ready to taxi. and that didn't quite solve it. So they actually ended up putting an APU in there. So the aircraft had its own independent electrical charging system, and once the aircraft was in the air, they could shut this down, and the aircraft generators would keep the batteries topped up. So all these were of a technical nature, but one of the most important things was the improved training of the pilots and ground personnel to a certain extent as well, which definitely improved the safety record of these aircraft. I'll go into that a little bit more now as well. One of the people they brought in was the famous Jimmy Doolittle, who had led the raid on Tokyo, and they brought him in. He had massive experience in the aviation industry going back to the years between the First and Second World War, and he was definitely the right guy to take a look at this problem. And he demonstrated flights at the MacDill Army Airfield, because they was being told by even the instructors, they were saying the aircraft couldn't be flown on one engine, and he was doing demonstration runs there to show that it could be done. He'd do a takeoff, get airborne, accelerate to VMCA, and then feather an engine and carry on flying, climb away, land on that engine, all within, banking into the dead engine, which was considered fatal by some people at the time. And he showed it could be done. His assistant was a guy called Major Squeak Burnett. And there's some great instructional movies that he made to explain to pilots in very simple terms, without getting too technical, about what they should and shouldn't do on this aircraft. And some of those videos are on YouTube if you want to watch them. Very much the style of the age, the Hollywood style of the 1940s. But they're good instructional films, and they definitely had an effect. And then lastly, they also employed some of the women pilots of the WASP service, who were ferry pilots, to come and demonstrate the B-26 to the cadets and instructors at Dill Field, in an attempt to shame the male pilots that this thing wasn't such a difficult plane to fly, that even the lady pilots could handle it. So this was some good psychology that they were using there. And lastly, the R2800 engine, which is, as I said, my favorite piston engine, and certainly the best of the bunch. These were the earliest models of this engine, the earliest variants, and there were problems, like any era engine will have teething problems. And one of them was actually nothing to do with Pratt & Whitney either. It was a carburetor company was using subcontractors who were putting parts into the carburetors, things like accelerator pump diaphragms. Remember, these were pressure carburetors as well. And these things were failing after a period of time. The components were failing for various reasons, and it took a long time to identify what the problem was and rectify that. So they were basically building in an engine failure into these engines at some point in time. And since, if you were the unlucky guy to get it immediately after takeoff, you were in all sorts of trouble. So let's look at the next. I haven't got the slide advanced system. I should have. Let's look at some of these problems with engine failures and what they do. And this is a little bit of a primer. I know we've got some pilots watching this. So I've kept it sort of semi-technical for those who are looking at this for the first time. VMCA, it means minimum control speed in the air, velocity minimum control air. The definition has varied over the years, but it's basically the same concept, where you have an aircraft with the live engine at full takeoff power, the dead engine on the critical side. There's a definition of that I don't want to go into now, but propellers are asymmetric things. So generally, if the propellers turn clockwise from behind, the left engine is the critical engine. The windmilling prop was obviously going to give you the worst case scenario there, with a lot of drag. The landing gear, they'll give you that retracted, but you will still have takeoff flaps, so some more drag there. Most unfavorable center of gravity, full aft, full rudder deflection, and 5 degrees of bank into the live engine, which assists the directional control. Now, if you have all these conditions, there will be a speed at which the aircraft will be controllable. Below that speed, it's not controllable. So in the case of the Marauder, this speed was 135 miles an hour. But remember, it's getting off the ground at 105 for a heavy aircraft, 95 miles per hour for a light aircraft. So you're getting off the ground at that speed. You need to get to this speed, 135, before you will have any control should an engine fail, and then you'll be in the situation I've just described. A lot of pilots back in the 1930s, late 30s and early 40s, they didn't understand this. This concept didn't even exist as I've described it to you. So they couldn't give you this sort of technical information. They had an idea about it, but they didn't have the breakdown and the diagrams to make it understandable. So basically what you had to do here was, if you had an engine failure after liftoff, the only way to stay alive was to close the throttles and land back, whether the gear was up or down. You would basically have to go and crash. But if you didn't, you'd find yourself on your back in no time at all. And it's much better to crash the right side up as upside down. And that was the critical situation. Now, to be fair to this aircraft, it's not the only airplane with this problem. I'm pretty certain the Mosquito was very similar. Perhaps the Mosquito would accelerate to its VMCA speed quicker than a Marauder. But the fact remains that you've got this gap, this 30 miles per hour gap, where you simply are not going to be able to fly away. And of course, this doesn't apply to modern commercial airliners, because they have enough thrust and they have enough directional control, and these speeds are calculated that you will not have a gap of 30 miles per hour between those two speeds. So that is the story on VMCA. We need to go look at another slide now, which is the next speed that's important in safely flying a twin-engine airplane, and that's VYSE. And this is the best rate of climb speed. So, okay, you've got to 135 miles per hour in your Marauder. Okay, in this airspeed indicator, it's there at 80. But anyway, let's say you've got to this speed. All right, you lifted off here. You got there. Now you're safe. If the engine fails and the gear is up, you can have directional control. But now, in order to be able to climb away, you have to accelerate all the way down to here, to this blue line over here. So this is now assuming that you've got the propeller feathered nice and smartly. You milk the flaps up till you can get to that speed. You keep your 5 degrees bank into the live engine, nice and smooth. Then you've got full rudder in, and as you get to the speed, which is often called blue line speed, that's VYSE, your single engine best rate of climb. And in a Marauder, that was 160 miles an hour. So now you needed to get another 25 miles per hour into the system before you could even climb away and avoid any obstacles that might be in your path. So do you see what a tricky airplane this would have been to fly for an inexperienced pilot back in those days? And now you can see why there's so many accidents. Because if it was prone to engine failures because of faulty carburetor parts, then you'd have to know your oats here and fly this airplane accurately and go for that 160 miles an hour no matter what. And once you're there, you can consider your life worth living. It's interesting to note that pilots were trained for short fields. The airplane lifts off in about 700 meters, and there weren't many runways more than a kilometer long in those days. So the crew were actually trained in the manual to take off with holding the control yoke fully back. So your elevators were fully up while you opened up power from standstill, and then you would keep the yoke back until the nose wheel came off the ground at about 60 miles an hour, and then at about 95 to 105, she'd slowly fly off. A very unusual way to remember, nose wheel aircraft in those days were not conventional. Everybody had tail dragger aircraft. So again, there was a bit of trepidation from the pilots not being familiar with a nose wheel aircraft and how to handle it. Today, a nose wheel is the norm, and tail draggers you've got to get a special rating for. So that was something worth looking at. So all these things were basically trained into the pilots so that to make the aircraft safer. So this slide is the accident rate versus the operational loss rate. So here we have it. In 2 fatal accidents in the first year of flight. Between those dates, they're up to November 41. So remember that the people who were flying these aircraft in training were mostly experienced pilots who'd flown, albeit slower tail dragger type bombers before that, but also factory test pilots and people like that. So there were only 2 accidents that took place in that period. But then 1942, when they started to train huge numbers of inexperienced pilots onto this aircraft, that's when we had the one a day in Tampa Bay. With the Doolittle remedies and better maintenance, the 1943 accident rate was 60% lower than the previous year, and that's a dramatic recovery. Was it such a bad widowmaker? Well, I found this statistic. The problem is you don't know, it doesn't give you a rate, it just gives you the actual number of accidents. So these are non-combat related accidents, largely training or in ferry flights and things like that. This is not as a result of enemy action. And the B-25, there were a lot more B-25s. So a little bit of a, interesting statistic that can be seen both ways. But despite that, the Marauders operationally were very, very successful. Once they'd ironed out some of their tactical problems, which we'll look at later. And this statistic you see bandied around, a loss rate unmatched by any Allied aircraft. Half of 1% was the was the loss rate. If you compare that to the heavy bombers and the RAF night bombing force, a much higher loss rate than these Marauders. There's reasons for that as well. But let's look at the development history of the aircraft before we get much further. It's also quite a confusing aircraft because of all the changes that we spoke about earlier on. You could always say that no two are quite alike. Well, it's not as bad as that. The B-26, the first 200 planes in that original order. The next big batch that I mentioned, which were ordered before before the first aircraft even flew, had some modifications. It was called the A model. And this would have been supplied to the Royal Air Force and the Commonwealth countries as the Marauder Mark 1, B-26A. So this is a short wing aircraft with a short tail, and modifications were brought in, improving the tail gun to the one we saw in the slides a little earlier, which was then standardized. So that was the B model. We're getting closer to a more productionalized model there. But from the B-10, what they call it, Block 10, through to the Block 55, the wingspan was increased. So there were B models that had the longer wings, confusingly. The C model was assigned to those aircraft that were built in the shadow factory of Martin's in Omaha, in Nebraska. So everything that came out of that factory was called a C model. And these all had the longer wing because they were built simultaneously with the B-26B in the Maryland factory. And this aircraft was then designated Marauder Mark II. So the Mark IIs were long wing aircraft, and you will see that these were the first Marauders that the South African Air Force received. Later models, the F model. This is the one where the angle of incidence of the wings was increased by 3.5 degrees. And they took that machine gun out of the nose. I mean, there were already 4 forward-firing machine guns, so they probably found it was a bit of extra weight and drag that wasn't required. And they put in improved armor, and this was known as the Marauder Mark III, which was used extensively by the SAAF. The G model is very similar. They just standardized some interior equipment, and they built a lot more. They built 300 of the F model, and they built 893 for the of the G model. So that's by far the biggest variant out of a total of 5,157 Marauders built. One of the ways to identify whether it's a short or long wing aircraft is to look at the carburetor air intakes on top of the cowling. If you look at this one on the right, it's got very large bulged carburetor air intakes, which means that it's a long wing model. Whereas this one on the left here, if you look in this area, you can see how small that intake is. It's very neatly done there, but obviously they needed more carburetor air. Maybe this iced up in service, and this is the oil cooler scoop at the bottom. So they made them bigger, and of course that would have contributed to more drag and a lower airspeed. So that's why the aircraft didn't really get any faster than the earlier models. The one on the left, interestingly, is at the Maps Air Museum in Ohio, and it was salvaged from the wilderness of the British Columbia. So it was obviously an early aircraft that was lost in a training accident. and it's a very nicely restored aircraft called Charlie's Jewel. Just take a look here at these canopies, hatches above the pilots. I will refer to that later in the video, but just to give you an idea that these hatches could open up, will give you some pretty nice ventilation, and in a ditching you would be able to climb out there. Wrong way. Cool. So the operational record of the aircraft, it was first issued to the 22nd Bombardment Group at Langley Field in Virginia, where it was replacing the Douglas B-18 Bolo, which is basically a DC-3 with a bomber fuselage. It's DC-3 wings, undercarriage, tail, and just like the Douglas Racer, it's a fairly slow aircraft. So these guys, but they were experienced pilots, so this type of transition would have been fairly smooth. Other groups were starting to receive the aircraft by December 1941. So with the Pearl Harbor attack in December of 41, this 22nd Bomb Group was deployed to the Southwest Pacific. They were shipped out to Hawaii, and then they flew across to Australia. And they started flying combat missions from Northern Australia, positioning at Port Moresby in New Guinea, and attacked the big Japanese base at Rabaul on the 5th of April 1942. So that was the baptism of fire for the B-26. But what's not generally known is that the Battle of Midway, there were no less than 4 aircraft, B-26s, that attacked the Japanese fleet. Now, if you watched the movie, you see these aircraft, and quite a lot of them, all produced by CGI in the movie, dropping bombs from medium altitude on the Japanese fleet, and they show you the Japanese fleet side-swiping and going around the bombs. That's actually incorrect. There were only 4 aircraft, and they were equipped with torpedoes. So now this is interesting because it was never designed as a torpedo bomber, and torpedo attacks need to be done at fairly low speed. The torpedo can't hit the water at 200 miles per hour. It's got to hit the water at a lot less than that. And remember, this is an airplane with a very high stalling speed. So it's probably, that's why none of the torpedoes succeeded in hitting any of the Japanese fleet, because American torpedo technology was notoriously poor in the early part of the war. And using these bombers as torpedo bombers was definitely not the best way to deploy them. So this mission, great heroism by the crews. 2 were shot down, and the other 2 were basically written off after landing at the end of the mission. The one of those that was lost was the Susie Q, which after dropping its torpedo raked the deck of the Akagi with machine gun fire. Remember, it's got 4 forward-firing machine guns plus the one in the nose. So they strafed the ship, and they managed to kill a couple of seamen, and a 0 was actually claimed shot down during the action as well. And then there was the one which was shown in the film Midway, Lieutenant Mays, after being seriously damaged. It looked like he was doing a suicide ramming attack on the Akagi. Whether that was the case or he was just out of control, but he apparently narrowly missed the bridge and cartwheeled into the sea. Allegedly, this rattled Admiral Nagumo, so that it's possibly why he called for another attack on the island in contravention of Yamamoto's order to keep a reserve in case the carriers were attacked. And so that's why the Midway played out the way it did, thanks to indirectly to the B-26 action. The B-26s were then withdrawn from the Pacific Theater in favor of the B-25 Mitchell. The Mitchells, with their nose section with 8 machine guns, were doing a great job attacking Japanese shipping, and they were also good at dropping bombs from altitude. So probably from a logistical point of view, it didn't make sense to keep the B-26 in the Pacific Theater. So it was withdrawn. It was one squadron that continued on until January 1944. So the Pacific Theater wasn't really the forte of the B-26. This photograph, it's a bit poor, but it's the only one I could find of the aircraft on Midway Island with the torpedoes slung underneath them. It shows you it's a very sort of Heath Robinson attachment of a torpedo in the belly of a medium bomber. but as I say, that played very little role in the way things panned out. Sorry, my selection of errors. Operation Torch was now the focus for the B-26. The aircraft were flown to England and then ferried out to take part in the attack on French Algeria. Initially, they decided to carry out low-level attacks against German targets, which were heavily defended with light flak. Losses were high, and so they decided to rethink this and go back to medium-level attacks, which is actually what it was designed for. And so the loss rate in the North African campaign was quite high, apparently double the loss rate of the B-25. So whatever the case, it wasn't a great start. But the Americans also battled a bit on the army side, had a few reverses and learned to use their equipment more effectively and learned better tactics. So Operation Torch served its purpose, with tactical doctrine for the American forces. The 12th Air Force continued using these B-26s in the Mediterranean theater, in Italy, advancing in Italy from Sicily, the Italian mainland, and eventually into southern France. And the French port at Toulon, with its heavy guns, was accurately bombed by the B-26s. They did, in fact, a great job there, which ensured the success of that campaign. And this Air Marshal Sir John Slessor, who was deputy commander of the Allied forces in the Mediterranean, in his appraisal wrote of the astonishing accuracy of the experienced medium bomber groups, particularly the Marauders. And so he was very complimentary. So when the aircraft was used tactically in the right way, and its excellent bomb sight was mastered by the crew, and they gained more and more experience and tactical methods,